In 175 AD, the Roman Empire is still formally victorious along the Danube, but the victory has the ambiguous face of wars that never end. After more than a decade of conflicts, invasions, epidemics, and punitive campaigns, the northern front is no longer a clear line but an unstable band of devastated territories, advanced forts, populations only apparently subjugated. Marcus Aurelius has been ruling in arms for years, far from Rome, and the very idea of a lasting peace always seems to be postponed until the following year. 175 was not born as a decisive year, but as a year of forced continuity, in which the weight of the immediate past weighs on every decision. To understand this, we need to go back a few months, to the end of 174, when the war seemed won, but not yet closed, and the Danube border continued to breathe like a badly cauterized wound, ready to reopen. At the end of 174 AD, the military situation along the Danube appears, at least in official communications, to be under control. The great invasions of the Marcomannic Wars have been repelled, the territories of the provinces of Pannonia and Moesia are once again garrisoned, many barbarian communities have asked for peace or have been forced to provide hostages, auxiliary contingents, and formal guarantees of submission. However, this apparent stability is the result of constant military pressure rather than real pacification. The campaigns of 172 and 173 inflicted very hard blows on the Germanic populations, culminating in clashes remembered by the sources as decisive, but the very nature of these peoples, devoid of a single political center and capable of recomposing themselves after defeats, makes any agreement fragile. In 174, Marcus Aurelius continued the strategy of a controlled advance beyond the Danube, penetrating enemy territories not to conquer them permanently, but to destroy their offensive capabilities, forcing the tribal groups to surrender separately. It is a war of attrition that only works as long as the Roman army remains numerous, disciplined, and supplied, and it is precisely here that the first signs of fatigue emerge. The legions engaged on the Danube front have been fighting for years without any real rotation, supplemented by hastily trained recruits and auxiliaries coming from the same border regions, often linked by ambiguous relationships with the populations they are fighting against. The Antonine Plague, which hit the empire starting in the 1960s, continues to reduce the number of available men and aggravate logistical problems, even if in 174 its direct impact on the front seems attenuated. 174 therefore ends with an indisputable Roman military superiority, but also with the awareness that this superiority is not infinite and that any mistake could be paid dearly. On a political level, Marcus Aurelius has now linked his personal prestige to the conduct of the war, renouncing long stays in Rome and accepting to govern from the camp, a choice which strengthens the imperial authority in the army but weakens the direct relationship with the Senate and with urban opinion. The barbarian populations, for their part, emerged from 174 exhausted but not annihilated. The Marcomanni have suffered profound devastation, villages burned, crops destroyed, and many of their leaders have fallen or been forced into submission, but they remain able to reorganize, especially in the areas less accessible to the Roman columns. The Quadi, traditionally more mobile, have alternated direct clashes with strategic retreats, avoiding annihilation and preserving fighting nuclei ready to re-emerge. The Sarmatian Iazyges, stationed in the Pannonian Plain, have suffered very hard blows, but their cavalry still retains a tactical value that Rome does not underestimate. At the end of 174, the Danube is no longer crossed by large masses of enemies, but remains a restless frontier, where small armed groups can strike suddenly and where the loyalty of the subjugated is often only temporary. In this context, the end of the year does not coincide with a true dissolution of operations. The Roman camps remain advanced, the legions do not return to the traditional winter quarters, and the winter itself is experienced as an armed truce rather than a break. The decisions taken in the last months of 174 directly influenced 175. Marcus Aurelius chose not to reduce the pressure, to keep the troops in an operational position and to prepare to intervene quickly in the event of new revolts. This choice reflects a clear but pessimistic assessment of the situation. The war can be contained, but not yet over. The Danube border on the eve of 175 is therefore an unstable mosaic of militarily controlled territories, subject but not integrated populations, and a Roman army which, although victorious, is beginning to feel the weight of the years of continuous fighting. It is from this legacy, made more of a precarious balance than of peace, that the year 175 begins, a year that inherits from the previous one not only the conquests, but also all its unresolved fragilities. At the beginning of 175 AD, Marcus Aurelius still found himself along the Danube front, far from Rome and its civil customs, immersed in a daily life made up of military relations, improvised audiences and decisions often taken under the pressure of urgency. It is no longer the time for great sudden advances nor for symbolic battles destined to immediately enter the collective memory. His role, in this phase of the war, is that of guarantor of the balance achieved with difficulty. The emperor did not always personally lead the marching troops, but his physical presence in the area of operations continued to be a central element of Roman strategy. The choice to remain on the front is not only military. It is a political signal addressed both to the soldiers and to the subjugated peoples, because it demonstrates that the supreme authority of the empire does not consider the war to be over and does not intend to move away from it before the situation is truly stabilized. Sources suggest that Marcus Aurelius spent much of his time between the main camps, moving cautiously but regularly, accompanied by an experienced general staff who by now had intimate knowledge of the theater of operations. His every move is measured, not so much out of personal fear but out of the need not to unnecessarily remove the emperor from the command center. In 175 his action did not translate into spectacular gestures, but into continuous supervision of operations, in the confirmation or correction of decisions taken by generals in the field, and in the management of a complex network of diplomatic relations with the barbarian leaders who accepted, at least formally, submission. Marcus Aurelius moves in a territory where the line between war and peace is thin. Every conversation with a tribal leader can turn into a lasting truce or a sudden betrayal, and every concession must be calibrated so as not to appear as a sign of weakness. His experience accumulated in previous years makes him cautious. He knows that the promises torn by force of arms are valid only as long as the army remains visible and ready to strike. In this sense, 175 was for him a year of continuous vigilance, in which the emperor exercised a less flashy but perhaps more tiring form of command than that required by large offensive campaigns. Managing the army absorbs much of his energy. He must ensure that the legions remain motivated, that supplies arrive regularly, and that the most tested units can rest without letting their guard down. Decisions on troop deployment are made taking into account not only immediate threats, but also the need to prevent future insurgencies. Marcus Aurelius is aware that the simple withdrawal of the legions behind the Danube could be interpreted as a signal of surrender, and for this reason he maintains an advanced presence, while avoiding actions that could trigger a new uncontrolled escalation. Alongside military activity, the emperor continued to carry out his role as supreme administrator, signing decrees, resolving disputes and receiving embassies, often in conditions far from the pomp of the imperial court. The sources tell of a sovereign who listens carefully, who takes notes, who reflects for a long time before deciding, an attitude that fits well with the image of the Stoic philosopher but which also responds to a precise political need, to show that the war has not suspended legality and that the empire continues to function even from the heart of a camp. In 175 this civil dimension of command becomes particularly important, because many of the issues addressed concern the fate of the conquered populations, the redistribution of devastated lands and the integration, forced or negotiated, of barbarian groups within the Roman system. Marcus Aurelius must decide who to punish and who to spare, who to consider definitively an enemy and who to be a potential ally, and he does so by seeking a balance between severity and pragmatism. There is no shortage of moments of tension, especially when news arrives of suspicious movements across the border or of unrest in the newly pacified areas. In these cases the emperor intervenes quickly, summoning the responsible commanders and ordering targeted demonstrations of force. His direct action in the field, although less frequent than in previous years, remains a key element in maintaining the cohesion of the army. The simple presence of the emperor during an inspection or training maneuver strengthens the morale of the troops and reminds everyone that war is a matter that concerns the entire empire. The evidence, albeit fragmentary, suggests that Marcus Aurelius in 175 appears more tired, but no less determined. The long stay away from Rome, the accumulated responsibilities and the awareness of the fragility of the results obtained weigh on him, without however translating into indecision. In some anecdotes handed down from late sources, the image emerges of an emperor who dialogues with common soldiers, who accepts the harshness of military life and who finds in discipline and order a refuge against the uncertainty of the future. At the same time, 175 is marked by a growing awareness that the war cannot be fought indefinitely without internal political consequences, and that any choice on the Danube front will have repercussions in Rome. Marcus Aurelius therefore governs like a man suspended between two worlds, that of philosophical reflection and that of military necessity, between the ideal of an empire governed by reason and the reality of a border that is still supported by the force of arms. In this year, more than in others, his role is not that of the hero who conquers, but of the guardian who watches over, aware that a moment of distraction is enough for everything that has been achieved in previous years to dissolve. During 175 AD, The Roman army engaged on the Danube front was no longer the one that had faced the first major waves of the Marcomannic invasions over a decade earlier. It is a force transformed by experience, marked by losses and adapted to a war that has imposed rhythms, tactics and priorities different from those of traditional campaigns. Military preparation no longer consists only of the ordinary training of the legions, but of a continuous process of strengthening, integration and correction that responds to a conflict without a quick solution. In 175, the army must first of all maintain its efficiency in conditions of prolonged attrition. Men who have been fighting for years far from their provinces of origin, units reconstituted several times, middle managers forced to manage soldiers coming from different contexts, sometimes even from populations that were once enemies. The need to maintain adequate numbers pushes the imperial administration to continue a broad recruitment policy, which draws on both the internal provinces and the border regions, including increasingly numerous auxiliary contingents. These troops, often specialized in forms of combat useful against the barbarians, such as light cavalry or mobile infantry, became an essential component of the Roman system in 175, supporting the legions in the tasks of reconnaissance, pursuit and control of the territory. The training is adapted to local conditions. The exercises favor speed of maneuver, the ability to react to sudden attacks and cooperation between different units, because the enemy rarely offers a pitched battle according to traditional canons. Even discipline, while remaining severe, takes on more pragmatic forms. The commanders know that maintaining morale is as crucial as punishing infractions, and in 175 controlled concessions multiply, such as rest periods alternating with shifts of advanced garrison. Logistics represents one of the most delicate aspects of military preparation. Supplying a large army in a region devastated by years of war requires an enormous organizational effort. In 175, the river routes of the Danube and its tributaries were exploited to the maximum for the transport of food, weapons, and materials, while the military roads built or improved in previous years became vital arteries for the movement of troops. The fortified warehouses, scattered along the border and in the rear, allow you to accumulate sufficient supplies to deal with sudden emergencies, reducing the risk that a barbarian attack could isolate a Roman contingent. The army's preparation also involves careful management of information. Scouts, deserters, and local allies provide news on the movements of the Germanic and Sarmatian populations, allowing commanders to anticipate possible threats. In 175, this information network is now well established, but remains fragile, because it depends on the loyalty of individuals who can change sides. For this reason, the Roman authorities cross-referenced information and always maintained a reserve of forces ready to intervene. The army's armament reflects its adaptation to the conflict. Shields, armor, and weapons are subjected to continuous repairs, and the local production of equipment supplements the supplies coming from the imperial workshops. These are not spectacular innovations, but constant adjustments that improve the resistance and functionality of the instruments of war. The psychological preparation of soldiers is equally important. After years of combat, many veterans have developed a profound knowledge of the enemy and the territory, but they also carry the burden of fatigue and losses suffered. In 175, the commanders leveraged the experience accumulated, entrusting veterans with key roles in the training of new recruits and in the transmission of effective tactics. This continuity helps maintain a high level of competence, despite human turnover. The constant presence of the emperor on the front further strengthens the army's preparation. Inspections, speeches, and military ceremonies, although sober, remind the soldiers of the political significance of their commitment and the centrality of the war for the destiny of the empire. In 175, the Roman army did not prepare for a single decisive battle, but for a long sequence of control, repression, and deterrence operations, aware that the force must always be visible to be effective. This continuous, almost obsessive preparation is the reflection of a war that taught Rome a hard lesson. On the Danube, it is not enough to win once, you must be ready to win every day. In 175 AD, the Roman presence beyond and along the Danube is not only measured in the number of legions deployed, but above all in the network of outposts, forts and garrisons that transform the territory into a controlled, observed, and continuously monitored space. After years of war, this network is no longer born from improvisation, but from a now profound knowledge of the landscape, its natural routes and points of vulnerability. The outposts are not all the same. Some are solid fortifications, erected in wood and earth or reinforced with more durable structures. Others are temporary garrisons, designed to house small but mobile garrisons, ready to intervene quickly. In 175, their main function was not so much to launch offensives, but to prevent barbarian groups from being able to reorganize undisturbed or cross the border without being detected. The Romans learned that control of the territory was not only exercised by winning battles, but by permanently occupying strategic nodes. Fords, valley crossings, hills dominating the plains and stretches of river suitable for the passage of men and animals. Each outpost is part of a larger system, connected to the others by military roads and rapid communication routes, which allow the sending of reinforcements or messages in a relatively short time. By 175 this network was now dense, but also expensive to maintain, because it required men, supplies, and constant vigilance. Garrisons are often made up of mixed units, legions flanked by auxiliaries, with tasks ranging from surveillance to the repression of small outbreaks of resistance. Life in these garrisons is hard and monotonous, punctuated by guard shifts, patrols, and maintenance work, but it is precisely this continued presence that makes Roman rule credible. The advanced forts are not just military structures. They become points of reference for local populations, places of exchange, sometimes of refuge, and instruments of political pressure. In 175, many barbarian leaders knew that the proximity of a Roman garrison limited their freedom of action and forced them to respect, at least in part, the agreements stipulated. The choice of places where to establish or maintain an outpost is the result of a careful strategic evaluation. Roman commanders favored positions that allowed them to control large portions of territory without excessively exposing themselves to ambushes. The experience of previous years has taught that an isolated garrison can quickly turn into a trap, and for this reason in 175 there is a tendency to avoid too bold advances without adequate support. The fortifications are strengthened with ditches, palisades, and embankments, and the garrisons trained to resist even short sieges, a concrete possibility in a context where the enemy prefers rapid and sudden attacks. The Danube itself continues to be a fundamental line of defense and communication. Along its banks there are forts that control river traffic and act as logistical bases, ensuring a constant connection with the rear. In 175 the river was not just a border, but a real military artery, used to move troops and materials with greater safety than land routes. The combination of these outposts creates a defensive depth that allows the Roman army to react with flexibility, absorbing any blows without immediately giving up ground. However, this system requires iron discipline and continuous coordination, because the loss of a single garrison could open dangerous gaps. Sources suggest that in 175 the attention of the commanders was directed above all to the consolidation of what had already been built, rather than to the further expansion of the network of forts. It is a phase of prudent consolidation, in which what exists is strengthened and the mistakes of the past are corrected. The Roman presence, structured in this way, also had a significant psychological effect. For the barbarian populations, seeing the territory dotted with enemy garrisons meant understanding that war was no longer an episodic event, but a permanent condition. For Roman soldiers, however, these outposts represent points of stability in a hostile context, places where the Roman order manifests itself in concrete and recognizable forms. In 175, therefore, the control of the territory is not expressed through large territorial conquests, but through a capillary network of presences that transform the border into a monitored space, where every movement is potentially observed and every rebellion can be quickly suffocated. It is a silent strategy, less flashy than major battles, but equally decisive for maintaining the balance achieved, and for preventing the sacrifice of previous years from being nullified by a new wave of violence. In 175 AD, the movements of the barbarian populations along and beyond the Danube no longer took the form of the great armed migrations that had terrorized the provinces in the initial years of the Marcomannic Wars, but were divided into a series of more fragmented actions, difficult to intercept and often intentionally ambiguous. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the groups associated with them have learned, at great cost, that facing the Roman army head-on almost always leads to defeat. Their strategy therefore adapts to a reality in which survival depends on the ability to move quickly, exploit knowledge of the territory, and confuse the enemy. In 175, these people are not at all inert. They move, observe, probe the Roman defenses, ready to strike where they perceive weakness, but equally ready to retreat when the imperial response manifests itself. The sources do not record a single coordinated offensive, but rather a series of movements that reflect the polycentric nature of barbarian societies, in which each group follows its own immediate interests, often in competition with those of its neighbors. The Marcomanni, hit hard in previous years, appear more cautious in 175, focused on rebuilding their resources and defending the areas that remained intact. Their movements tend to avoid the areas heavily garrisoned by the Romans, favoring wooded and hilly regions where mobility is greater and the risk of a direct clash decreases. The Quadi, traditionally more flexible, show a greater propensity to move, alternating periods of apparent quiet with sudden small-scale incursions, which aim to test the reactivity of the more advanced Roman garrisons. These actions are not aimed so much at conquering territory as at keeping the pressure alive, at remembering that submission is not definitive and that the border remains permeable. The Sarmatian Iazyges, although weakened, continue to exploit the vastness of the plains to quickly move their cavalry contingents, maintaining a threat capability that Rome does not ignore. In 175 their movements are carefully monitored, because their possible recomposition could call into question the balance achieved. Alongside these major populations, a constellation of smaller groups move even more unpredictably, sometimes acting as temporary allies of the Romans, sometimes as opportunists ready to take advantage of the chaos. War, in this context, is not only a question of armed clashes, but also of waiting, negotiation, and mutual intimidation. In 175 many barbarian leaders showed up at the Roman outposts to renew agreements, deliver hostages or ask for concessions, while others deliberately chose to avoid any contact, interpreting the distance as a form of resistance. These diplomatic movements are inseparable from military ones. An embassy can precede a royal truce or mass war preparations. The Roman commanders, strengthened by their accumulated experience, carefully observed these signals, aware that behind every gesture there was an evaluation of the balance of power. The territory thus becomes a space of continuous armed negotiation, in which the barbarians try to preserve their autonomy without provoking an overwhelming reaction. The raids, when they occur, are rapid and targeted, directed against isolated settlements or less protected supply lines, and almost always end with an immediate retreat. In 175 it is not a question of striking to destroy, but of striking to survive, to acquire resources and to demonstrate that the capacity for offense has not been cancelled. This way of fighting puts Roman patience to the test, because it forces them to maintain a high level of alert without offering a clear target to destroy. At the same time, the barbarians have to deal with the reality of a territory increasingly dotted with garrisons and patrols, which limit freedom of movement and increase the risk of interception. In 175 it clearly emerges how the war has transformed into a struggle of psychological as well as physical resistance. The Romans try to convince their enemies that any attempt at rebellion is useless, while the barbarians try to demonstrate that the empire cannot control everything, everywhere and forever. In this game of unstable balances, even immobility becomes a strategic choice. Many groups prefer not to move at all, waiting for external events, such as an internal political crisis in Rome or a reduction in forces on the border, to create new opportunities. 175, seen from the side, is a year of armed suspension, in which the silence of the most visible movements does not equate to a surrender, but to a pause full of tension. The barbarian populations observe the empire carefully, measuring its determination and ability to sustain a prolonged war, while Rome, in turn, studies the signals coming from beyond the border to anticipate the next move. In this tangle of minimal movements, ambiguous negotiations and latent threats, the Danube front of 175 appears like a living organism, in which every movement, however small, can have disproportionate consequences, and where war continues to exist even when it does not manifest itself openly. In 175 AD, the Danube front did not experience large pitched battles destined to enter the manuals, but a continuous sequence of clashes, skirmishes and armed actions which, taken together, define the real progress of the war. It is a year in which violence does not explode in just one point, but is distributed along the entire line of contact between the empire and the Germanic and Sarmatian peoples, taking on different forms depending on the terrain, the forces involved and the immediate objectives. Ancient sources, lacking in precise chronological details, reveal a fragmented picture, in which clashes are often the result of sudden movements, raiding attempts or preventive operations conducted by the Romans to prevent the enemy from taking the initiative. During the year, numerous armed contacts were recorded between advanced Roman patrols and barbarian groups, especially in the less permanently garrisoned areas, where the woods and hills favored rapid ambushes. These battles, although limited in the number of men involved, have a significant strategic importance, because they serve to maintain constant pressure and deny the enemy the possibility of moving freely. Roman troops, often composed of mixed detachments of legionaries and auxiliaries, are trained to react quickly, forming compact defensive formations and exploiting their superiority in equipment and discipline. The barbarians, for their part, try to strike with sudden violence, aiming to inflict casualties and retreat before reinforcements can arrive. In some cases, these clashes degenerate into more extensive fighting, especially when a barbarian group is intercepted during a raid or when attempting to cross areas controlled by the Romans. In 175 there was no shortage of punitive operations conducted by the imperial army across the border, with columns advancing to destroy settlements suspected of supporting the armed resistance. These actions, although not always documented in detail, fall within the Roman strategy of deterrence. Strike selectively to discourage new rebellions. From a tactical point of view, such expeditions favor speed and coordination, avoiding penetrating too deeply without adequate support. The consequences are often devastating for the affected communities, but limited in time, because the goal is not permanent employment but a demonstration of strength. An important role is also played by clashes linked to the control of communication routes, in particular fords and river routes. On several occasions, during 175, barbarian groups attempted to intercept supply convoys or hit isolated garrisons, forcing the Romans to react with rescue operations. These battles highlight the importance of cooperation between the units stationed in the different outposts. The speed with which the garrisons are able to support each other often determines the outcome of the clash. Not all armed contacts were resolved in favor of the Romans. Some sources suggest that there were episodes in which advanced units were rejected or forced to retreat, especially in unfavorable terrain. However, even these partial failures do not translate into a significant strategic change, because the imperial army has sufficient reserves to quickly re-establish the situation. From the point of view of the barbarian populations, every battle won, even if limited, takes on an important symbolic value, fueling the belief that resistance is not entirely in vain. For Rome, however, the objective remains to prevent these local successes from turning into a broader movement. In 175 there was also fighting on a psychological level. The visibility of the Roman operations, the speed of the reprisals, and the constancy of the patrols serve to convey the idea of uninterrupted control. Some clashes occur following violations of submission agreements stipulated in previous years, when theoretically pacified groups take up arms again or provide logistical support to other rebels. In these cases, the Roman response is particularly harsh, because it aims to re-establish the credibility of the agreements and dissuade imitations. The immediate consequences of the clashes of 175 are therefore multiple. On the one hand, the maintenance of an overall Roman military superiority. On the other, the perpetuation of a climate of insecurity that prevents a true normalization of the border. The human toll of these actions is difficult to quantify, but the losses, especially among the barbarian populations, contribute to worsening a situation already marked by famine and forced displacement. For the Roman army, each clash represents a further consumption of energy and resources, but also an opportunity to refine tactics and coordination. In 175 there is no decisive battle that ends the war, but a series of confrontations which, added together, consolidate an unstable balance. It is a war fought without fanfare, made of blood shed far from the big cities, in places that rarely find space in celebratory narratives, but which determine, day after day, the holding of the border. In this year, more than ever, war manifests itself as a constant and widespread presence, which grants no respite to either the victors or the vanquished, and which continues to shape the destiny of the Roman Danube without offering a definitive conclusion. In 175 AD, the weight of the war along the Danube rests not only on the shoulders of the emperor, but on a generation of Roman commanders who gained their experience entirely in this long and irregular conflict. The generals operating under Marcus Aurelius are not isolated figures of charismatic leaders in the manner of the late Republic, but high-level military officials, trained in the discipline of obedience and the complex management of men and territories. Their importance in 175 is decisive, because the emperor cannot be everywhere and the fragmented nature of operations requires rapid decisions made on the ground. These commanders act in a context in which personal initiative is necessary, but must always remain within the limits of a general strategy marked by prudence. In 175, the Roman generals found themselves governing spaces rather than conquering cities, preventing crises rather than resolving them with a single blow. Many of them already have years of service on the same front behind them and know not only the terrain, but also the habits, fears, and reactions of the enemies. This empirical knowledge becomes a fundamental tool, often more useful than any abstract order. The relationship with Marcus Aurelius is marked by vigilant trust. The emperor listens, evaluates, and sometimes corrects, but rarely imposes rash solutions. In 175, a model of shared command clearly emerges, in which the political center defines the general objectives and local commanders choose the means to achieve them. This balance is not without tensions, because every decision involves personal risks and responsibilities. A general who makes a mistake does not only endanger his own career, but the entire stability of the sector entrusted to him. The sources do not always hand down the names of these men clearly, but they reveal figures of expert commanders, often coming from the senatorial or equestrian order, who built their reputation on crisis management rather than in the search for glory. In 175, their main task is to maintain the cohesion of the troops, ensure the functioning of the outposts, and react firmly to any sign of rebellion. The war taught them that indecision is as dangerous as excessive aggression. Some generals stand out for their ability to combine military action and negotiation, knowing when to strike and when to negotiate, a quality particularly appreciated in a context where force alone is not enough to guarantee peace. The episodes handed down suggest that there is no shortage of moments of friction between commanders and local populations, especially when agreements are broken or when security needs impose harsh measures, such as deportations or requisitions. In these cases, the generals act as direct representatives of the imperial authority, taking on the moral and political weight of the decisions made. Their relationship with the soldiers is equally crucial. After years of war, trust between commander and troops is a determining element for operational effectiveness. In 175, the generals who manage to maintain discipline without resorting to excessive punishment are the ones who achieve the best results, because they understand that accumulated tiredness cannot be ignored. Some anecdotes, which have come down to us indirectly, tell of commanders who share the soldiers' efforts, who participate in marches and inspections, thus strengthening a sense of solidarity that goes beyond simple hierarchy. Others, more rigid, maintain a formal distance, relying on the authority of the role and the Roman military tradition. Both approaches coexist in 175, reflecting the diversity of the personalities involved. The ability to coordinate between the various sectors of the front is one of the most complex aspects of their work. Generals must communicate with each other, exchange information and, when necessary, send reinforcements, without excessively weakening their positions. This network of interdependent decisions makes command an extremely delicate function. In 175, more than in other years, it emerges that the Marcomannic War was not the product of a single military genius, but of a community of commanders operating within a system. Even errors, when they occur, are absorbed by this system, which tends to correct itself rather than collapse. The figure of the Roman general in this year therefore appears less heroic and more pragmatic, but no less significant. It's a role that requires psychological resilience, adaptability, and a deep understanding of the line between strength and control. In 175, these men embodied the continuity of the Roman war effort, ensuring that the imperial will was translated into concrete action even in the most distant and difficult places. Without them, the presence of Marcus Aurelius on the front would be an empty symbol. Thanks to them, however, the empire manages to maintain a fragile balance, entrusting to expert hands the daily management of a war that allows no errors and which continues to consume men and resources without offering a definitive conclusion. 175 AD draws to a close without fanfare, without triumphs celebrated in Rome, and without the solemn proclamation of a definitive peace. But precisely for this reason its balance sheet appears more eloquent than that of many years marked by great battles. From a military point of view, the Roman Empire maintains control of the Danube front, rejects any attempt at large-scale destabilization, and maintains constant pressure on the barbarian populations who had dared to challenge it in previous years. No provinces are lost, no massive invasions cross the border, no legion is annihilated. This result, apparently modest, is in reality the fruit of a continuous and exhausting effort, which requires a permanent mobilization of men, resources, and political attention. 175 demonstrates that Rome is still capable of sustaining a prolonged war, but it also reveals how high the price of this ability is. The Danube regions remain militarized, marked by the constant presence of the army and an economy adapted to war needs. The territories beyond the river, although not formally annexed, were profoundly affected by Roman action. Villages destroyed, populations reduced, tribal balances altered irreversibly. From the point of view of the barbarians, 175 is not a year of total defeat, but not even of redemption. The communities survive, adapt, wait, but understand that freedom of movement and action is now limited by an imperial presence that does not seem willing to retreat. The war transformed their way of fighting and thinking about the relationship with Rome, imposing a logic of intermittent resistance rather than open confrontation. For the Roman army, the balance of the year is ambiguous. The military machine works, but is subjected to constant pressure that slowly consumes its efficiency. The legions remain disciplined and operational, but the accumulated tiredness is evident, as is the growing dependence on recruits and auxiliaries coming from increasingly heterogeneous contexts. This transformation is not yet a crisis, but it represents a signal that cannot be ignored. On a political level, 175 turns out to be a delicate year, because while the external front seems relatively stable, internal tensions emerge which remind us of how fragile the balance of the empire is. The long war strengthened the role of the emperor as supreme commander, but also accentuated the distances between the center of power and some elites, creating spaces of uncertainty and ambition. Marcus Aurelius, while maintaining control of the situation, was aware that the military victory was not enough to guarantee the overall stability of the empire. The human toll of 175, although difficult to quantify, is heavy. Soldiers fallen in minor clashes, civilians hit by raids and reprisals, entire communities forced to move or submit. It is a widespread suffering, without a cathartic moment that could justify it in the eyes of contemporaries. Yet, precisely this normalization of violence is one of the most significant aspects of the year. War is no longer perceived as an extraordinary event, but as a structural condition of the border. In 175, the idea was consolidated that peace, if it ever came, would not be the result of a single victory, but of a slow process of attrition and control. Looking at the year as a whole, a picture of unstable equilibrium emerges, in which each actor involved is aware of their own limits. Rome knows it cannot lower its guard. The barbarians know they cannot openly challenge the empire. The army knows it must continue to hold without certainty of an imminent return to normality. 175 does not end the Marcomannic Wars, but defines a mature phase, in which the objective is no longer to win quickly, but to avoid losing. In this sense, the real result of the year is the confirmation of a containment strategy which, although effective, requires continuous vigilance and a willingness to sacrifice which will weigh on subsequent generations. The Danube, at the end of 175, remains an armed border, full of recent memories and future threats, a place where the empire still shows its strength, but also its vulnerability. Marcus Aurelius and his men know that the war is not over and that what has been gained can quickly be lost. The assessment of the year is therefore not a conclusion, but a suspension, a pause full of tension that preludes new developments. It is the sign of an empire that resists, that adapts, that continues to fight even when the finish line is no longer visible, and that in the operational silence of 175 reveals, perhaps more than at any other time, the complexity and cost of its own survival.